Welcome to the Writer Jerk Podcast. I am your host, James Kirst. I am the author of 2 books, Ghosts Are Assholes, published in 2018, and Magic Once Removed, published in 2020. Both books were published by World Castle Publishing, LLC. They are available in several places, including Amazon.com and JamesKirst.com/books, though the links will be provided in the description. I have written approximately 50 short stories, which are also available on JamesKirst.com. If you like any of them or have any constructive criticism, please leave me a comment. My novels mostly focus on paranormal mysteries, urban fantasy, and/or straightforward fantasy, but my short stories tend to gravitate toward horror, slice of life, fantasy, and comedy. Now that the obligatory plugs are out of the way, let's get on with the show. Today I want to talk about witches and how they are used in storytelling and folktales. Specifically, I want to discuss the misperception that people believe that they have always been used as villains, and sort of using them as heroes is a recent phenomenon. What do I mean by villains? Think the Wicked Witch of the West. Think the image of a hunchback, green-skinned woman riding a broom or toiling over a boiling cauldron. These are the iconic images in the West, but is it true that they are often used as villains? I've done no more than cursory research into the subject, I admit. I mean, that's the sign of a good podcast, isn't it? One where the host constantly admits that he doesn't do research. But the truth of the matter is, the history of witchcraft, witches, and Wicca, and its modern-day practices, is an endlessly fascinating subject for me, as should be obvious by my novels. Considering Magic Once Removed, I'll say again, has a witch as a deuteragonist. And this subject matter warrants more than a 15-minute podcast. I'd like to do a more professional, documentary-style commentary video at some point on the subject in the future, but I doubt I will have the time. I especially won't have the time in the near future, that's for sure. Besides, this sort of thing has been done by experts in the field, so there is little insight I might be able to provide except for now. Except when I want to discuss this subject matter, because I am surprised that during my cursory amount of research, witches have not been used as villains for as long as I might have thought, or I think a lot of people have thought. True, there are stories where witches are villains. There's no argument about that. But it's not as if they had been used as nothing but villains until the last 30, 40 years or so. Keep in mind, though, as I'm speaking right now, I'm talking about witchcraft and witches as it pertains to Western civilization. I know witchcraft is treated differently outside the West in a variety of different ways. So without further ado, let me just say that. So let's think about it. Last 30, 35 years, can you name any mediums where witches are the bad guys, villains, or at least villains just because they are witches? You might be able to find 1 or 2 where they are the bad guys, or one of which is a bad guy, where it's balanced out with a good witch or good witches, but I'd be hard-pressed to find any where they are the bad guys, just pure villains. I mean, where they're good guys, I can think of dozens off the top of my head. Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Willow from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I had such a crush on Allison Hannigan when I was a teenager, by the way, even though I really wasn't that big of a fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Charmed, were a show about 3 sisters that were witches, and I swear I watched that because of the plot, not because of any other thing, even though I can't remember how a single episode went. Even as you go beyond television shows, into the realm of video games, you have Morrigan from the original Dragon Age, a game series where I found the first game to be fantastic and the second game to be terrible, so I fell out of the series. I think a lot of people did as well, although I think it's still a popular game. Regardless, the aforementioned in a different podcast, Murdered Soul Suspect, although I think the witches were technically mediums who saw ghosts and were wrongfully accused of conducting witchcraft because of it. But that's neither here nor there. They weren't portrayed as villains. You have even the cartoon Kiki's Delivery Service, which was about a little girl who delivered packages on a broom. And it's kind of funny because nobody in the village seemed concerned that a little girl was riding a broom, so definitely wasn't a bad guy there. Everyone knows Harry Potter, who, along with all his friends, burned in hell for witchcraft, at least according to Ned Flanders. I think the Johannes Cabal series had witches. I think Miss Smith was called a witch, even though she was technically a necromancer. Now that I think about it, I think all the witches in that story were necromancers, the ones that were called witches, though the phrase might have been just used interchangeably. And to be fair, that necromancer and witch has been used interchangeably throughout history, so that's not really that surprising if they were used interchangeably. Anyway, with regards to books, do this right now. Search on Amazon for Witch Hero books. And by witch, I mean W-I-T-C-H, not W-H-I-C-H. You're going to get hundreds, if not thousands, of results. You know, it is a very popular subject to make witches the heroes right now. And if you look back at the last 35 years, you'll struggle to find a book, a movie, a television show, a video game, or any sort of entertainment medium where witches are the bad guys because they are witches. There may be bad witches, but they are not bad because they are witches, or are somehow naturally evil because they are witches. And I think that's something that people think has come up through a lot, you know, where the witches were just bad guys because they were naturally evil, and they were naturally evil because they were witches. So what can I think of that has been made in the last 35 years where witches were the bad guys? I'm struggling a bit. Hocus Pocus in 93? They weren't really evil, though. They were the bad guys, but it was conveyed in a humorous manner. And I think most people actually like the witches because they were portrayed in such a fun way. The Craft in 96? You know, not really a famous movie at this point. And I don't think those girls were really evil. I think they were getting vengeance for being wronged at school and went overboard and naturally got their comeuppance at the end for it, but they weren't really evil. Maybe the witches and the Blair Witch Project, although I'm not even sure you actually see a witch in the Blair Witch Project. The Hagravens in Skyrim, the game? I mean, the Hagravens were more like bird creatures to me than anything else. They were called witches, but they weren't really the traditional witch, at least not in my mind, except for, of course, they did cast magic spells and such, so I guess in that way they were witches, but, you know, could have been just a generic term for evil magic caster. Actually, now that I think about it, video games might be a terrible example. I mean, there are hundreds of Nintendo games, and by Nintendo I mean NES games alone, and I'm sure dozens of them have witches as bad guys just because it was an easy thing to grab and make into enemies. But then again, you'll have like mushrooms as enemies in video games. So using video games as an example is not a very good one because I'm sure you can find dozens of games, many of which, believe it or not, I haven't played, that use witches as enemies. But since almost anything can be used as an enemy in video games, doesn't really matter now that I think about it. So let's move on. So you might be thinking, fine, the last 35 years are one thing, but surely in the old days of movie making, the so-called golden age of the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and 60s, they were always used as the villains, right? To quote the late, great John Pinette, I say, nay, nay. Well, you say that can't be right. The Wizard of Oz surely is an example, at least in the famous 1939 version with Judy Garland. I mean, I just used the Wicked Witch as an example earlier in this podcast as an evil witch. True, but she's balanced out by Glinda, the Good Witch of the North. So, witches as a whole weren't evil, just one witch was evil. Alright, one example. That's just one example. How about another one? 1942, I Married a Witch. It's a romantic comedy of sorts where the male descendants of a family are cursed by a witch to always marry the wrong man. Again, it's a comedy. That's villainous, sure. Except it's kind of mitigated because the first man who was cursed was the Puritan who burned her at the stake. And even then, she wound up marrying the descendant who was in the 1940s at the end, as her spirit survives being burned at the stake, even if her body didn't. And I think she's able to reconstruct her body, and she looks like Veronica Lake, so she's smoking hot. So, and she winds up marrying the male lead at the end. So she certainly wasn't evil in that one, and was never portrayed as evil in that entire movie. There's Bell, Book, and Candle in 1958, a Jimmy Stewart movie. Whatever else you might say about the plot, is just a kind of a silly romantic comedy where a witch might have to give up her powers if she falls in love with Jimmy Stewart. She certainly wasn't portrayed as a villain, and this movie contained perhaps my favorite line in movie history, and I'm going to quote it verbatim. Jimmy Stewart's character, Shep Henderson, says, "That girl you know, Jillian Holroyd, she's one." His female friend, Merle Kittredge, says, "A witch?" "Yes. Shep, you just never learned to spell." So, brilliant. I really do love that line. That's really funny. Makes the whole movie worth watching, if you ask me. Bewitched is a famous example in the 60s, where the wife was a witch. The family may have hated Darren and treated him badly, or at least without respect, but none of the witches there were evil. The children's movie Bedknobs and Broomsticks, they weren't evil either. There are some movies, obviously, where witches were the bad guys during this era, but the only ones I can think of right away are Black Sunday in 1960, which was a horrifically violent movie, especially for its time. But wait a second. The witch was actually getting revenge for being unjustly sentenced to death. She was more driven to become evil than truly evil, so that's not really a great example. I mean, she was doing bad things in the movie, but it was with the tinge of, but the people who were getting their not really getting their comeuppance, but she wasn't evil just because she was a witch. It's more like she was driven mad. So how about maybe The Witchfinder General, this 1968 movie? No, that was just Vincent Price being crazy and torturing the people to death for no real reason except for he was sadistic. And I'm not sure there was actually any witches in that movie. I think the people he was persecuting were all just innocents that he wanted to torture for no reason. All right, maybe not in the last 100 years, but surely in antiquity, in the bygone age, witches were treated as villains. Well, yes and no. Though it is not quite antiquity, there is little doubt that Christianity has had a tumultuous relationship with witches, to say the least. I mean, there's the witch trials of the 14th century, and they continued until about the late 17th or 18th century, at least in Europe, and that was doubtlessly a dark time. And, the most infamous example in the United States, of course, is the Salem witch trial. And doubtlessly, countless number of people were persecuted and unjustly killed during this time. And so there's little doubt that this was a bad era in human history. And also, I am sure that there were many stories birthed during this era that depicted witches as the bad guys during this era. And I'm not sure how many have survived. I know a lot have survived in folktales and the like. And I'm sure during this era, witches were depicted as bad guys because they were witches, not because they were just bad people who happened to be witches. On the other hand, interestingly, at least to me, there aren't many stories in the Bible that mention witches directly except for the Witch of Endor. And I'm going to paraphrase the story a bit. This is my own words, not words directly from the Bible, obviously, once you hear it. So basically, Saul was about to fight the Philistines in a war. Saul asked God to let him know the result, but God basically said, "Saul, buddy, the future is still unwritten. You got to find out some things by yourself." Saul wasn't happy with that, so he sought the help of the Witch of Endor so she could revive Samuel's spirit, the famous King Samuel, to get advice and a prediction. Now, there's some debate whether the witch did it or whether she took credit for God's work, but regardless, Samuel's spirit appears before Saul and tells him, "Man, you're a moron for doing this. God is really unhappy with you right now. By the way, you and your men are going to die in battle tomorrow. Maybe because you ticked God off, I don't know. Sorry about that. Anyway, you have a good one. Good luck." And he gets killed in the war. And so do his men. He gets routed. And there's some debate whether Saul killed himself at the end or told somebody else to kill him. Not that it really matters outside of semantics. I've heard one person at least say that that's why magic and necromancy was banned in the Bible, but I think that's tenuous at best, because Saul was said to have driven out all the necromancers and magic users out of Israel, I believe. by that time, so he had to actually seek out the Witch of Endor. So I don't think that's the reason why necromancy and magic was banned, or at least seriously looked down upon in the Bible. I don't think that had anything to do with it at all. Interestingly, I've also heard that it's once believed to accuse one of witchcraft meant you believed in witchcraft. Therefore, you would be the one who's persecuted. Though, again, I didn't really check the source. I'm not sure that's true at all, to be honest with you. It's just something I've heard. I would actually bet, if I were a betting man, that it's false. But what is true is there is a folktale in Italy of La Befana, who visits children on the eve of Epiphany, a Catholic holiday. She delivers presents to children in a manner similar to Santa Claus. Though the story was likely borrowed from pagans, my point is, especially with the last two examples, or La Befana certainly, is that perhaps hatred of witches may not have been as universal in Christian circles as one might believe. How about before Christianity, though? Let's go a little further back. Let's go to, not quite to antiquity, but to somewhere around 700 to 1000 AD, to the story of Beowulf. To be honest, I'm only bringing it up because I'm sure someone will ask whether Grendel's mother was a witch, and I found some sites online that did refer to her as a witch or a water witch, though I cannot help but think they were influenced by an illustration of Grendel's mother by J.R. Skelton from Stories of Beowulf, published in 1908. I do not believe she is specifically referred to as one in the poem. True, if you were to apply the loosest of definitions, I suppose you could call her a witch, as she does live underwater and she is a magical entity of sorts. Of course, most scholars only debate whether she was a warrior, a spirit, or a demon. Part of the reason for the debate comes from the fact that Grendel's mother was described almost heroically in the poem, as if she were merely avenging her son. Moreover, one of the words used to describe her might translate to woman warrior, giving her an almost noble air. As almost an aside and a digression, though, I want to bring something up with regards to that debate. I don't understand why she is always depicted as a human woman these days. I'd understand it more if there's some debate over whether the woman was indeed Grendel's mother. Perhaps maybe the word mother was a mistranslation or could have been a mistranslation. But no, there seems to be no debate over that. She was indeed Grendel's mother. Then, as Grendel was described as a monstrous being, wouldn't she be monstrous as well? I doubt the apple would fall that far from the tree. So even if she was a woman warrior, even if she was noble, I'd imagine she'd look like Grendel. It's not like I envision, if Sasquatch was ever found, that his mother would be Claudia Schiffer. So I don't know why Grendel's mother would be Angelina Jolie. Anyway, that's just an aside. That's just been something that's been bothering me for a while. As I said earlier, I guess she is sort of magical, so she could be considered a witch, at least colloquially. But as I alluded to earlier, there's debate over whether she was villainous, so I don't think it's like she's an evil witch in the traditional sense. I think that would be a stretch to say that she was one of those evil witches that the stories always wrote about, or anything to that effect. So let's finally get to antiquity. So in Greek mythology, let's look at Greek mythology for a second. Circe. Well, Circe wasn't really evil. She did turn Odysseus' men to pigs, but she turned them back to normal after Odysseus basically fooled her, and then really liked her, apparently, afterwards, and spent the next year in bed with her, even though he was married. That's fine, I guess, but okay, Circe may have been a homewrecker, although I'm not sure she knew about Odysseus' wife. But regardless, she's not evil. Medea. She helped Jason, and the two were happily married for, well, as it goes in Greek stories, I think about a decade or so before Jason decided, I'm bored with this relationship, I'm going to seek another woman, or something like that. I don't know, my Greek mythology is a little weak. Speaking of weak subjects that I'm familiar with, Baba Yaga and the Slavic tradition. In most accounts, she wasn't evil. She certainly wasn't nice. That's why her name comes up in many stories about like a fearsome witch, because she was a brutal individual. But the thing is that I think in most stories, if people just left her alone, she'd have been happy staying in her cabin in the middle of the woods. Most stories that involve her do end badly, and I mean really badly for the protagonist. But a lot of the times, if not most of the time, if not all of the time, these protagonists were either committing evil had just committed evil or were just evil, just plain evil, and looking to get something from her. She then met out some sort of horrific punishment, but, it wasn't really done because it was evil. It wasn't done out of a sense of justice either. It was just ensuring that people get their just desserts. It was sort of like an Ace of Fable sort of thing. You do wrong, you seek out somebody to try to erase the wrong, and only to find you can't erase wrong. Sometimes you have to just pay for what you've done, sort of thing, and make up for it in different ways than just seeking an eraser to erase all the things you've done in the past, that kind of story. So, Baba Yaga, a jerk, like I am, but not evil. Grimhildur in the Norse mythology was kind of a jerk as well, but all mythological characters in the Norse mythology were kind of jerks. I kind of remember a story where Thor, I think he goes to this family's house and says, hey, the goats you have, we can eat them and it'll be great. I think he was hanging out with Loki at the time as well, and it was like, hey, he and I we can eat those goats of yours, and then I can revive them, as long as while you're eating them, you don't break any of their bones. And I think as they eat them, one of the children accidentally breaks a bone of the goat, and Thor's really ticked off because now he can't revive the goat. And he says, I'm going to kill every one of you in the family. He's going to kill the mother, father, and the two children. And the parents negotiate to enslavement. So the two children are now enslaved by Thor. And he's like, all right, I won't kill you then. So Norse mythology was kind of brutal. So even though Grimhildur might have been portrayed as evil, so were pretty much every person in Norse mythology. So that wasn't a witch thing. Morgan Le Fay in most portrayals is evil in the King Arthur legends, but think about it. Merlin, even though he's mostly called a wizard or sorcerer, he really is more or less a witch, right? He casts spells like the rest of them and things like that. So she's kind of balanced out with Merlin. I know it's female versus male and all these other complicated things you could read into the stories. I know that. I'm just trying to make a blanket statement right now, though. So it's just kind of interesting. I'm not even making a definitive claim. I'm just saying that's kind of interesting. So you look at folktales and you say, well, folktales, witches are used as villains pretty often. And that's true. I am not arguing with that notion at all. And the folktales must have come from somewhere, and it's likely from the examples, like I said, the Christian persecutions and things of that nature, right? You have Hansel and Gretel, the witches bad, trying to eat Hansel and Gretel. Rapunzel, the witch won't let Rapunzel, get out of the tower. The witch fools Snow White and causes her to sleep or die or whatever the original story was. You have Sleeping Beauty, where she pricks a finger and everybody in the kingdom sleeps. But it's funny, at least when you look at Disney movies. Maleficent, they made a movie trying to redeem and basically say, well, Maleficent wasn't as bad in Sleeping Beauty as you might have thought. She was kind of a jerk, but she was also kind of lovable, that sort of thing. I haven't seen the movie, but that's what I've been led to believe. Unfortunately, the witch in Snow White didn't quite get that treatment, though I guess it's hard to redeem a character whose name literally has evil in it, as in evil queen. So as I get towards the conclusion of this podcast, you're probably thinking, all right, I'm cherry picking, and you'd be right. I am cherry picking a bit, but the idea of this podcast is simply to broaden your thinking and start a discussion that perhaps witches in fiction, especially when you look at stories from the bygone age to now, it's much more complex than you might have thought initially. It's not just witches were bad guys and had been until 2010. It's like, no, the witches have been shown as good guys even in old stories. And I mean like 3,000 years old stories. I'd almost go as far to make the argument that using witches as heroes or unambiguously good protagonists has become so commonplace that using them as the main antagonists or villains that are unambiguously evil could almost be considered subversive in modern storytelling. You'd actually be a rebel making a witch character that's evil because she's a witch at this point. That is what I believe. Anyway, do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think I'm full of it? Please let me know. Who knows? Maybe I made this entire podcast just to anger you. After all, I'm the Writer Jerk. Anyway, until next time, this has been James Kurst, the Writer Jerk, now signing off. Halloween is rapidly approaching, and what better way to celebrate the season of ghosts and witches than buying my books, Ghosts Are Assholes and Magic Once Removed, available on Kindle and paperback, on Amazon, the Barnes & Noble website, and a boatload of other places. The links will be provided in the description. If horror is your thing, go to the horror page on jamescurst.com for a plethora of horror short stories, including the Fang series. If horror isn't your thing, still go to the jamescurst.com site as well, as I've written a variety of other types of short stories. Also, if you don't like horror, don't let it dissuade you from picking up one of my novels. Ghosts Are Assholes and Magic Once Removed aren't really horror, even though they star traditional horror villains, albeit in much different roles than they are traditionally depicted. They are more mysteries and adventure tales with supernatural elements. Please pick up both today. Thanks for listening. Please like, share, and comment, both here and the jamescurst.com page if you've enjoyed. Have a great day.